In this paper, which again I can give you a reference to, these are the character virtues that are regarded as important in disaster management. It's not all-inclusive. There are some that may not be there. You may recognise some of these, but I want you to pay particular attention to three as we go through this today. The virtue of prudence. The idea that people have to be wise, they have to be shrewd, they have to understand the context in which they work. You have to exercise good judgment. Stewardship. That's responsible planning and management of resources that you have to hand, but also of yourself. How thinly are you spread over time, over all the activities that you participate in? The final part of my presentation this morning, I'm going to be talking about a study that we've done with mental health professionals, looking at their experience of assisting during recovery. What's it like going through a recovery with a population who's been badly affected by it when you're part of that community too? And communication. It's great to be doing all this activity, but how do you communicate with others? How do you communicate to your publics? Not just one public, you have several publics. You have several groups of stakeholders who you are trying to serve. You have your clinical community, you have your research community, you have the wider community, you have your public stakeholders, government, funders, all these different publics that you're trying to serve and communicate with. How do you do that? How do you do that in a cost-efficient, time-efficient, resource-efficient way? Okay, we want you to be thinking about that too. In Tom/Rainer's presentation first off, we talked about the 4Rs model: risk reduction and readiness, response and recovery. So what I'm going to be talking about today is that roughly split into three parts: before, during and after. Again, with the ideas of prudence, stewardship and communication in mind. So let's start with before. Just to recap some of the things that you already know. Some of the disaster mental health effects that you will see depend upon roughly these three different characteristics, these three facets of the Rubik's Cube of disaster impact. First one is we've talked about in some of the other workshop sessions, the type of the disaster. Is it a natural hazard that's turned into a disaster for the affected population? Is it a technological type of disaster? So maybe perhaps there's been a train derailment or an aircraft disaster. Or was that malicious? Or is there a suspicion that it was malicious? Okay, so we know, for example, if it was arson in a bushfire, if there is a suspicion that it was deliberately lit, that someone has done this deliberately with some kind of malicious intent, it takes that community at least double the time to come to terms with that. Exposure. Was there a warning? So for something like a typhoon, you can see it kind of generate, but if you look at Patricia recently on the Mexican coast where it hit, that developed very, very quickly. That was a real surprise for people. So climate change is already having an impact upon, suspected impact upon what kinds of warnings that we're going to get for what we traditionally thought were long lead-in time events. The intensity, your proximity to it, so not just your geographical proximity, but we know that people who are only 1 or 2 degrees removed from the community of impact still feel the ripples of post-traumatic stress risk. The duration of the event, and as I said before, the intent. What is the perceived intent of this? You know, people can say, you know, I've done something wrong, this is an act of God, this is some kind of punishment. That is often a belief that people may have, and they want to kind of right that wrong before things can progress onwards. And Douglas spoke very eloquently about this idea of risk, this ecological view that we need to take. It's not just the intrapersonal factors, but it is how we sit within our communities and the wider resources within those communities. So governance structures, schools, community centres, community movements, all of these are important risk and resilience factors within how people react and respond to disasters. So I want to just make sure that we understand the importance of the DRR framework. And are people familiar with the Hyogo framework for action? Do you know what that is? Would anybody like to volunteer a quick explanation? So this was a framework that was in place globally signed off by the UN General Assembly between 2005 and 2015 around activities that should be in place for disaster risk reduction. Martin and I were talking about this. How many times was the health sector mentioned in this document?
Around 4 times.
Around four times, yeah?
Around 4 times you mentioned health alone.
Yeah. So there's been a massive process around negotiating a new framework for action, 2015 to 2030. This is to take place. The Sendai Framework for Action, which was agreed in Japan earlier on this year. How many times is the health sector being mentioned in this one?
Around 40 times.
40 times. Huge win for the health sector in order that we get global recognition of the importance of the health sector and health activity for disaster risk reduction. But with that recognition comes responsibility. Okay? If your nation is part of the UN General Assembly, your nation has ratified this document. Okay? You now have leverage in your countries to say, we are bound by this, we should be undertaking activity to deliver upon this framework. But you also need to be aware and exercise that prudence around the political rhythm of how these decisions are made and the financial rhythm of the resourcing around these decisions. Okay, so you need to be really quite smart about thinking about when are the meetings taking place in your country? What are the ways that you can feed into that decision-making process? Say for in New Zealand, we're now on the Security Council. There was a big push around Sendai to get this done. Once the agreement was done, nobody's interested. You try to get any kind of like traction to talk about Sendai now, the window has closed. We're probably going to be waiting for another 2 years before there's some kind of global check-in process around, well, how are you doing with Sendai? And then there'll be a whole load of flurrying activity around that. So my job is to prepare for the next window, identify the next window, get people ready to make some kind of representation so that the voice is heard. So what does it specifically say? You'll get this, you don't have to write this down, okay? Specifically in this section 30, enhance the resilience of national health systems, including integrating disaster risk management into primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare, especially at the local level. So there's a recognition that it's not just a national system, it has to be reflected locally. Developing the capacity of health workers in understanding disaster risk and applying and implementing DRR approaches in health work. It's not enough for just the top level or management of the health system to be knowledgeable about this. It's right down to the health workers. Promoting and enhancing training capacities, and also these DRR approaches in health programs in collaboration with other sectors. So it's not just health alone, it's the whole of the government sector. Specifically for you, Priority 4 and Section 33, enhance recovery schemes to provide psychosocial support and mental health services for all people in need. So having good needs assessment processes in place and to have the capacity and capability to deliver psychosocial support where it is needed. Okay, you now have a global mandate to do this work, if your local mandate wasn't enough. So let's just recap, what do we mean by psychosocial support? We talked about this before, right? They reckon that around about 80% of people who go through disaster situations don't need any intervention, formal intervention. They can call upon their own resources, either interpersonal, their family or their wider community structures in order to adjust to that situation. We're trying to improve social ecology. Essentially, we're trying to focus upon the network of relationships linking individuals to each other within and between communities. What we can often see if you look at Rob Gordon's work in Australia is that we can see that we have fractures that occur within and between communities, and then suddenly it becomes this battle for resource between some communities that feel favoured and some communities who do not. Okay, so part of our role is to try to heal that, spot that, heal that, or at least process that when that's coming up. And considering culture and values by being mindful of the value and meaning given to behaviour and experience as reflected by individuals and communities, not going in with assumptions as to what a particular story means. So Marvel, you talked about yesterday in your poster presentation how these myths are not always unhelpful. They can actually be protective sometimes to make sure that the social fabric, the social capital is maintained in this time of stress. Okay, so really thinking about what does this story mean that I'm hearing? What's the benefit? Who benefits from it? So in New Zealand, we had these principles of psychosocial recovery. This is my entry into disaster management work. Before this, I was a clinical psychologist working in a physiotherapy department in a hospital in New Plymouth. I decided I wanted to leave that job, so I took a 6-month role developing this massive pile of documents into a short, readable document. And I've not been able to leave disaster management since then. This has been 10 years now almost that I've been doing this. So in that, very briefly, the principles that we outlined, there's a relationship between the psychosocial element of recovery and other elements of recovery. Okay? As the built environment recovers, as the natural environment recovers, so the people recover. If the built environment cannot recover, the natural environment cannot recover, the recovery of the people is delayed. They're affected by that. They are intertwined. You cannot separate them. So although you see a lot of resource going into the built environment, yes, that will bring the people up to a certain extent, but not all of them. You know, inequalities come with that. And that's why one of those principal virtues, if you remember at the beginning, was justice. We have a strong sense of social inequity, and we are sensitized to when that occurs. We see that. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. Self-help to more intensive forms of support should be operationalized through a well-supported triage process, immediately post-event and onwards. Okay, so you have a good assessment system. For some people, all they need is to be pointed to the right information or the right community linkages such that they can support themselves and make sense of their experience. We were speaking in one of the groups where people were saying that actually they kind of need their experiences normalized. Right? This is actually quite common for people, and that's enough. Knowing that they're not alone in going through this experience is enough. Often you'll find that when you do research actually has an impact upon those people who participate in that research. That's another place where you can be effective. So in New Zealand, this looks like this. Okay, so at the bottom, you have this idea of basic services and security. At the next tier up, we have these community and family supports, and these are some of the services that are involved in that. We have the focused, non-specialised supports at the kind of primary healthcare physician level. So you're looking at general practitioners or associated health workers operating at that level. Then only at the top tier, these specialised services, which are around about 5 to 15% of the population will need those services. That's where you have the specialist psychiatric or psychological services for the more severely affected. Okay? You don't wait to get these services up and running. Some people will go straight in at tier 4 if they have had particularly problematic lives, if they have risk factors to have elevated symptomology. Some people will perhaps need these more basic services, but unless they're in place, the risk is that they move up the pyramid. What we found in New Zealand is that a lot of people said, you know what, I don't need the help right now. You can go and help other people. We're now starting to see those people in years 3, 4, and 5 start presenting as specialised services because they've left it so long that their problems have become entrenched. So they have all these symptoms that now they see as kind of normal, but it now gets in the way of them operating their regular lives. Okay, so you need to be making sure that you're going in and checking the needs of the community at regular intervals. We had an interesting discussion yesterday, but it's certainly in New Zealand, and I would encourage you to think about this quite carefully. When you have outreach or screening or intervention programs for trauma or related problems, just because it happens in a disaster situation does not mean you drop your ethical standards. Yeah, so if your research programs or clinical interventions are taking place in disaster scenarios, they should not be put in place unless you have good governance structures around that. Because what you will do is you will breach trust. And if you breach trust, it's very, very hard to get it back. It takes ages to build that trust. It only takes one incident, widely publicised in the media, for it to be broken. We were just having a conversation around the importance of trust and reputation with Abby on the way here today. I can't understate that. Operational effectiveness in psychosocial recovery from emergency events stems from effective readiness phase actions. You need to be doing it now while the disaster is not occurring. It's too late to be doing it when the disaster is underway. You need to be doing all of that work now. And that means not just within the health sector, but across all parts of the disaster management system. So it may be that you need to form those relationships now. If you get a phone call in the middle of the night, you're much more likely to answer it and do something if you know the person at the end of the phone. If you're getting a stranger at the end of the phone, you're having to do all this kind of getting to know each other, figuring out what their role is, what your role is, when there's work to be done. So you need to sort that out first. I'm doing okay for time, so I can move to during. I'm going to talk about the New Zealand context, and again, the experience that I know best is the Christchurch and Canterbury earthquake. So hopefully you'll be able to learn something and take something from this and apply it to your own situation. That's what I'm hoping you'll be able to do. So New Zealand is not part of Australia. It's a different country. I didn't mean that at all.
Yes, probably known as the West Island.
Yes. Douglas actually worked at Massey University before I got there, so we know each other reasonably well. And it's lovely to be able to be with him now, even though he's in Australia. So it's a small country with a small population, but a complex hazard profile. Okay, so we're subject to, we're called the Shaky Isles for a reason. We have earthquakes all the time. We have storms all the time. We have severe weather a lot of the time. We have only 4.4 million people. We have one of the largest diasporas in terms of percentage of population of any country. You will see a New Zealander pretty much everywhere you go. You'll meet them. If I've lived in New Zealand for 10 years now. I was saying to her beforehand, if I bump into a New Zealander overseas, I probably know someone that they know. Reputation is really important, right? And you'll know that from your own kind of local context as well. Within your region, you'll be known. And it's really important to guard that. So the largest population centres are on the North Island, except for Christchurch, which is the largest city on the South Island, which is just here. That's where Christchurch is here. We have the biggest fault is the Transalpine fault, which goes across here. If that goes, it's predicted to be a magnitude 8, possibly larger earthquake, which will have a severe impact upon New Zealand life. So in September 2010, we had the first in a series of earthquakes. That was actually the larger earthquake. This just shows you the fault I was just talking about here. In February 2011, we had the major loss of life earthquake, where 185 people died, and with extensive repeated liquefaction, so people's houses got this bubbling kind of smelly mud-like substance into their house time and time again. So in September 2010, there was no loss of life, happened in the middle of the night. So people thought that they got off relatively lightly, and to a certain extent, perhaps could be argued that there was some complacency. Now, this was an unexpected earthquake, although if you look at indigenous knowledge, there was definitely knowledge that this was a risky area. If you look at the old maps of Christchurch, it was basically built on a drained swamp. And we knew that there was seismic activity under there, but there hadn't been any for a while. But perhaps one of the reasons that we fell into that sense of complacency was that we mistook low risk for no risk. If you look at the global hazard map, every bit of New Zealand is high risk compared to other regions of the world. So it's interesting, right? Relative risk, it's that kind of frog in the boiling water, okay? The frog doesn't know that it's in the warm water and the water's heating up if you don't look outside in the world and compare your temperature to what's happening in the rest of the world. This is followed by a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in February 2011. It's a lower magnitude earthquake, but far more damaging just because of the way the fault was angled. The fault slipped and it was directed right under the CBD of the city, and it slipped upwards. And it was some of the fastest vertical acceleration of an earthquake that's ever been measured. Partly because we have a lot of sensors in New Zealand in order to be able to measure that. But I'll give you an idea as to what that looked like. That's just a rough distribution map, and you can see here was the original epicenter of the earthquake in Darfield. So it wasn't actually in main Christchurch, but it was a substantial, for New Zealand, population area. And then we have the 6.3 shock here. It's classed as an aftershock, but actually it looks like it was possibly a different fault, most likely a different fault, which has its own aftershock sequence. So you have two earthquakes with their own aftershock sequences, and then another two after that, in June 2011, and then in December 2011 after that. These were substantial aftershocks. And one of the reasons why it's important to note this is that a lot of the insurance firms delayed paying out because this insurance sequence, as far as they were concerned, was still ongoing. So there were a lot of people with damaged houses who were prioritised to work but couldn't even get assessments in because they said, we're going to wait until this is over. That was never explicitly said, but their actions spoke louder than words. We'll talk about the impact of secondary stresses later on. So you can see from this one here, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, 2.7 G-force, single direction on that left-hand column. The one in February 2011, 2.2 G-force, second highest recorded after Tohoku, which happened at that point. It was the largest. Tohoku happened a month later. So it's a significant jolt, vertical jolt, and people report feeling, and there were videos of roofs actually lifting off houses and then falling back down again. Okay, so it's a pretty scary experience for them. If we compare that to Nepal, we see this fault rupture in Nepal, 7.8, but the peak gravity acceleration was 0.6, so less vertical shock. But you've got a quake that's 250 times larger than happened in Christchurch. Okay, 76 million people exposed to ground shaking, strong ground shaking in Nepal, 435,000 in Christchurch. But if you look at violent ground shaking, a different class, then you look at, actually it's higher in Christchurch. And you've got bigger potential terror impacts because of that. Okay, so it's an important earthquake from that point of view. And what happened was you had a big self-evacuation out of the area. Maybe up to 20,000 people at last estimate, which is probably the largest internal migration since the 1930s and 40s in New Zealand. And with that, great uncertainty. If you look at the size of the nation compared to the Japan GDP, it's probably going to cost Japan around about 3% of their GDP. It's probably going to cost us more like 10% of our GDP. So substantial economic impact, not just for the region, but for the whole country. The whole country carries and underwrites the cost of this. Okay, so small country, large consequences. So when we're thinking as mental health professionals, we're thinking not just the immediate impact, but what is the risk carried forward now? What is going to be the impact upon health services? What are people going to be thinking about in terms of disaster risk reduction, capacity and capability building in order to meet similar challenges in other areas in New Zealand? So we know that homes are affected, our sense of safety, our sense of security, our sense of refuge, our sense of togetherness. So people come together in family homes. If your family home is no longer operating, where do people meet? I remember reading and experiencing whenever I would go to Christchurch. I live in Wellington. So again, just a slight aside, I have a very strange position in that I'm familiar with what is going on in Christchurch and Canterbury, but I live in a different place. Now for me, that felt like a real disadvantage at the very beginning because I felt somehow disconnected. But as I've progressed through the recovery, I've seen that as a real advantage. I'm familiar enough to know what's going on, and I'm known by the community and I'm known by the officials there, but I can stand far enough away to give them frank feedback and to be able to say, do you know what, I'm seeing this. I'm not sure what your experience is like, but I'm seeing this from here. So I'm able to offer that distance, which at the beginning felt like a disadvantage, but as we've gone on has felt like a distinct advantage. Work. We've been here together for what, 13 hours on the first day? 12 hours again yesterday? Substantial hours again today. Work takes a big portion of our lives. Abby and I were talking today about how much time we spend working, right? And how we try to manage that in our lives. When work is taken away from people because their work premises are damaged, don't underestimate how much of a big impact that is for people. Okay? It gives them a sense of purpose. If people have work in their lives, it gives them a reason to be getting up in the morning for many of them. You take that away, it's difficult. And for yourselves too, you get a great deal of satisfaction from your work. When you're not able to work, how does that feel? How long does it take you to relax when you go on holiday?
For me, straight away. Straight
away, easy. You're good at it. Excellent. It takes me a good week or so to switch down and to calm my mind down to be able to go on holiday. So, work takes us over sometimes. And play and rest, okay? So one of the things that we've understood, I think, more in Christchurch and Canterbury as we've gone on, is that existing is different from living. to fully participate in life and have all of your community assets in place, your community relationships in place, is different to existing. So one of the things that I think that we pay great attention to is if you look at the things that people miss in disasters, in the top 10 is access to community space and the access to be able to mix and work with and to recreate with other people. Okay, we underestimate the impact and the influence of in life satisfaction for people of that. We know this. Just to recap, the responses we might see. If we're forewarned, we're much more likely to see this anticipation, this anxiety, but on the plus side, we're more likely to see planning. If it's unexpected, we're much more likely to see shock, fear, uncertainty, but also confusion as well, and it differs according to man-made or terrorist events. But we know that there's a greater degree of disturbance if there's a change in the entire physical and organisational structure of a community, if the impact consists of more than the impact of the physical event and persists for a long period of time, and if there are additional subsequent impacts and disruptions that require further coping. If your disaster and the one that you're trying to meet the challenge of, meets these three criteria, you're in for a longer haul, and you're likely to see a greater degree of disturbance. Familiar with this graph, this picture of people? So what we tend to see is this warning and impact. You see this kind of adaptational response, and you sometimes see this honeymoon period immediately after the impact. You see this community coming together, much of aid coming in, foreign assistance, all sorts of things pouring into the country. And then what you tend to see is this tailing off. Other events tend to take over, or bureaucracy takes over. Yes, the aid is there, but it's the wrong kind of aid. Who wants second-hand clothes from the West with oversized people when actually what we want is money? We need money to buy food and resources, local food and resources, not stuff that's shipped in from overseas that people don't like or are not familiar with or can't prepare. Okay, what we want is tatami mats, for the Japanese to make them feel like they are in a place that they're familiar with. And tatami mats also mark out space. Okay, this is my own private space. What we tend to see is this area of disillusionment, where actually community functioning goes below the previous level equilibrium. Now what we're starting to discover, I think, is that this dip goes on a lot longer in Christchurch, and it goes through lots more ups and downs than this nice smooth graph going up to enhanced community and individual adaptation. I'm not sure what your view is on that, but I'll invite you to discuss that with me later, but certainly in the workshop afterwards. What are the likely things that you might see in your communities during recovery? So there is this popular idea now in Christchurch that we see the 4 tribes of Christchurch. We have the hopeful, the untouched, the disillusioned, and the angry. Okay, the untouched were those people who perhaps lived in the north and the west suburbs of Christchurch, where they knew an earthquake happened, but it didn't affect their property. They don't work in any other area of Christchurch. They pretty much stick to their suburbs. So yeah, theoretically there was an earthquake, and it kind of disturbed them and it scared them for a few weeks, but nothing really has happened after that. We have the hopeful. We have those people who see action taking place in their community. They're lucky enough to have lived in suburbs where resources have been put in. Okay, they think that things are going to get better. And then we have the disillusioned. We have the perhaps socially deprived areas which weren't working so well beforehand or had challenges beforehand, and they've seen massive damage and very, very slow to have resources or supports put in. And we have the angry. We have those people who have this disillusionment, and have reacted with it with much more arousal, much more anger at how they feel that their contract of trust with the government and with insurance companies has been broken. My deal is that I pay you a premium. I pay you a premium and you carry my risk. The risk has been realised and you have not paid out, and you don't look like you're going to pay out. And the government is not doing anything about it as far as I'm concerned. So I'm very, very angry, which delays recovery, which has massive community reverberation. Think about how that looks in your community. What does the word resilience mean to those that hear that message? When people are told that they should be more resilient, how do you think that makes them feel?
Should I?
Sorry?
Should I have the resilience? I mean, I'm in shock now. Should I have it?
Somehow you're seen as lacking, right? It's like it's your fault. You're not more resilient. That was certainly the reaction that we got. There's a real pushback against this idea of resilience. So it actually became a word that I did not mention for a good year, because the reaction that you get from that word means that anything else you say is not heard, because you're just another resilience expert who's come into this situation. So be careful about language and how it's perceived, right? Resilience is a word that we throw around technically, but actually for communities, it may not be that word, it may be other words, but be sensitive around that, the meaning of those words. We have this truncation of time versus strategic information processing. What I mean by that is that in order to process information and use it strategically, you need your frontal cortex working. If your frontal cortex is not working because of fear or because of worry about how you're going to feed your family, if your limbic system is activated and you don't have a lot of time to be spending on processing information, it doesn't matter how much information you give people, they're not going to process it. They're not going to hear it. So often in disaster risk management, the problem has been that people will go, look, we've given them the information, but they're not doing anything about it. It's their own fault. Okay, think about whether information is actually what's needed by people in those periods of time. Actually, what we should be doing is promoting calm, so people are able to use those parts of their systems internally and within their communities to hear and understand their risk and to act upon it. I'm just going to move through a few slides now. So what I found is that my role has changed, and my role is multiple. And I'm just going through a few here now, and I invite you to think about yours later on. I have a tactical role. So I act as a clinical advisor. One of the biggest things that I do, which is invisible, right? It's not written up. It's not a paper. I've not written a paper. I should write a paper about it. But it's actually preventing harm. It's preventing stupid things from being done and silly things by well-meaning people who want to do something, or they have a political imperative to do something. They want to do something, but it's actually telling them, don't put your resources in that, put it in this instead. You're giving them options. One of my failures that I see is that I was not able to prevent counsellors from other places being put in to the response in the initial period because they felt like they had to do something and the counsellors locally were swamped. It was a political decision. I was actually working on my kitchen table in London at the time, and it was the middle of the night, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I had to give a very, very careful radio interview so as to not to annoy people. But you will have wins and losses around that, and people feel like they need to do something. But the other thing that you can do is to offer supervision and mentoring for those clinicians or those researchers who are working in affected areas. So even though you're not contributing directly, you are supporting those people who are working directly. I have a strategic role. I contribute as one input into evidence-informed policy. Okay? There is a difference between evidence-informed policy and evidence-based policy. I actually think it's quite arrogant for us as researchers or as scientists to say that we provide the evidence and it is your duty to act upon it. We are but one input into that system. There is all kinds of trade-offs that are going on that we perhaps don't understand, but we need to understand. We need to be more cognizant of that. I was lucky enough to work as a private secretary to one of the ministers in the UK government just before these earthquakes were happening. It was a real eye-opener to me in terms of how the Secretariat protect and channel information that gets to a minister, the ultimate decision maker. So you need to know more about that system around the Secretariat that surrounds the decision makers. Get to know those people, understand, build relationships with those people. Once you're starting to have conversations with them and you're providing them options for solutions, not just a description of the problem or one option, you need to come with a portfolio of solutions. So I have an advisory role with the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, which is a special government department that was set up locally. I have a few others as well. But I also have a really interesting media role as well. So I have gone out and I've cultivated relationships with reporters who I thought were good. So actually I think that you write fair write-ups. They're not one-sided, they're not sensationalist. I'm actually going to try and have a relationship with you such that when there is a story about a disaster, then you can feel free to call me. And if I can't talk about it, that's fine, I'll pass. If I can, I will. I'll give you something meaningful that you can use. I was also in a very strange position where I was asked to broker a relationship between the media organisation in town and the government agency in town where their relationship had broken down. So it's really offering free and frank advice to the media organisation as to what they were doing poorly, but what they were doing well, and what they could do to increase the amount of stuff that they were doing well. But also free and frank advice to the government agency around their comms strategy and their communications work and what it is that they weren't doing so well and what it is that they could do better. So always thinking about what they could do better. You know this. Leave people with actionable stuff that they can do that is positive. So leadership role, we've been very lucky. We've managed to be the group that has rewritten the National Health Emergency Plan for New Zealand. It was our group that did that, and that got published last month. That's incredibly valuable opportunity for us. But that was all built upon 8 years of trusted relationship, that we were given the opportunity in a tender process, and we were chosen to do that. And we're about to rewrite the National Psychosocial Support Advice document. We're just in the final stages of negotiation of that, fingers crossed. I have a research role, which I'll tell you about in the final 10 minutes. And I have this community partnership role. So when there was an earthquake in the north part of the South Island, which affected Wellington, the community there were affected, and they asked for a seismologist to come to talk to them about the risk and what that earthquake meant. And I went along with the seismologist. So the seismologist gave their 45-minute presentation on what the geoscience said about it, and then I gave a 30-minute presentation on what that would mean for them. And just before I started talking, there was a magnitude 4.5 earthquake. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but we were 2 kilometres away from the epicenter of a very shallow earthquake. So although there was a magnitude 6 just across the strait, maybe about 50 kilometres away in Wellington, which I experienced, this was much bigger. People were thrown off their feet and had to get down under tables. So when I started doing that talk, my heart was beating so hard in my own head, I couldn't actually hear my voice when I started talking. I see the video of it now, and I'm like, yeah, I can tell. I'm looking a bit scared in that video. But you know what? That gives you a lot of community currency. It's like you were actually here when that happened, and now you're going to talk to us about this stuff. So you know what we've just experienced. You get some idea around what it is that we've just experienced. So try to leverage that is important. So the three things I want to leave you with in that little bit that I've been talking about is listening. For the first 4 months that I worked in Canterbury and Christchurch, I was very quiet. You may be surprised to hear that. I'm quite vocal usually. But I spent 4 months where people actually said, Sarb, you're not saying anything. And I was like, yeah, no, I've been away for 2 years out of New Zealand. I'm just going to be listening now because I don't want to be treading on other people's toes. I want to understand not just the phenomena from a community point of view, but the system that is trying to deal with it. And I'm not trying to come in over the top of that. We have a no surprises policy of operation. If I feel like I'm going to say something that's critical, I will try and say it to the person. I won't say it in public. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work the other way around. Okay, so often things will come from government agencies or other agencies that are going to surprise you. They'll do their best if you have a good relationship to let you know, but sometimes it's just not possible, and you kind of can't take that personally. You know, it doesn't always work that way. That's just how the system works, in my experience. And also this idea of political and financial rhythms. So what can you do to communicate with your stakeholders? We've taken a decision in our team that we're going to always put out 2 products. We're going to put out a public sector, public information product, and we're going to try and underpin it with an academic output as well. So we decided that flooding was a real and present danger in New Zealand. People weren't talking about it enough. So we wrote an editorial, and it got published the next day by the Dominion Post, which is the paper in Wellington. It's read all around the region. And there had been some floods that had taken place, and we wanted to address that issue. And then a couple of days ago, we wrote that up as a 3,000-word article, which was a review of all the flooding literature that had happened, being published between 2008 and 2015. That got accepted for publication. That will be published hopefully early next year. So this is one way of thinking about, well, yes, we have research outputs, but who's going to read that? Who's going to pick it up? Who are the influencers that need to understand that this is a risk? This got picked up and got talked about by the Ministry of Primary Industries. New Zealand is an incredibly primary sector focused and dependent economy. If the farms fall over, the economy falls over. So they read this and they took it up and they said, okay, so this is important for our rural communities. How do we support rural communities that don't have enough water to get through the farming season to get pasture and feed their cows? Because if that falls over, it has a massive impact on the whole of New Zealand. So we were really pleased, and that's kind of a strategy that we're going to take forward. Also thinking about what's useful and what's usable. So I'm on the advisory group which has developed this app for Android and iOS, which is about 5 minutes with your kid. Spending 5 minutes with your kid with an activity. So it has a list of 50 activities that are cheap, require little resources that you can do with your child, and it's really about, exactly as Abby was saying, building that parenting bond relationship with preschoolers. Because if you focus upon that, they're much more able to withstand challenges that come on their lives, and the parent is too. Yeah, they've got a better relationship with their kid. So that was as a direct output of the experience of the earthquakes and thinking about, well, how do we improve resilience of children and parents in this situation? I'll come back to this. There are various public documents that we can have impact in and on as psychologists, as mental health professionals, if we can find the right people to talk to and to input on that process with. The last thing I want to talk about is the impact on mental health professionals. How long have I got? Can I have another 5, 10 minutes?
You can even take 10 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Great. Good. What we discovered, and this was 2 years after the impact of the earthquakes, that we actually got money to do this. It took a long time to figure out who had money left over, or how could we kind of figure out at the right time of the year that we could actually get a pot of money to do this. What we found was that people didn't have a language to discuss what they were experiencing in Christchurch. They knew they felt bad, but they didn't know why. Because they felt like, well, my house wasn't that badly damaged. It was damaged, but my life's not that great, but it was not that bad either. So I feel bad about complaining, but I'm also living in this place where everything is broken, and all the stuff I used to do beforehand, I can't do anymore, and my kids don't seem to be particularly happy, and work is really difficult, and it takes me ages to get anywhere now. This isn't the life I had before. So there's a grieving, there's a mourning of the life that you had before, particularly for people whose lives haven't been changed that much before. Right? It's different when your life is changing all the time. In our GP study, what we found was the GPs were telling us, those people with mental health difficulties did okay. Because they're used to dealing with difficult stuff all the time. So this was just another difficult thing for them. For those people who didn't experience a lot of change in their lives, this was huge. This meant that they had to engage with a system to try and get resource, which they had not engaged with before, and they found that very difficult and stigmatizing. So we started developing these posters and basically was telling people what they told us in these focus groups and telling them that it was okay. It was absolutely normal. It was all right to be feeling these emotions. So it's all right to feel frustrated. It's all right to feel a little blue now and again. Blue is kind of like an expression for feeling quite depressed, right? It's all right if you're feeling pretty stoked. Stoked is feeling happy. Okay, it's okay. Your life actually might be all right. Don't be ashamed of feeling okay. You don't have to kind of like suppress that either. It's all right to feel proud of how we've coped. It's all right to take pride in, actually, we did this, we did that, and that worked. Okay, that worked for us as a community, as a family, or as an individual. It's all right if you're over it right now. It's like, no, just don't really want to be doing or thinking about that. It's all right to feel overwhelmed some days, the recognition that some days are better than others, and it's very, very up and down process. It's all right to feel lucky, put in places that were quite badly damaged. This is a heritage building. New Zealand's a relatively young country. That's a pretty old building for New Zealand. But also thinking about relationships too. When was the last time you got caught up in the moment? One of the feedback that we got from the Maori community, which is a much more collective kind of culture, if you think about the Hofstadter scale that Douglas put up earlier on, is that they didn't see families there. And that was an issue. So we redesigned all of these posters, and we designed them with more family orientation and groups and sharing food as groups, and that had a lot more currency and engagement. And we asked people to submit their own ideas as well, and we produced them as billboards on bus stops and also on the backs of buses as well. So this was like a big poster that we produced and put up on posters where my partner just takes time to hold me in their arms. And we designed graffiti templates, which we said, okay, these are some particular areas where young people can use these, the graffiti templates, and we can decorate areas using that. But I'm going to talk about recovery for the last section of this. This was published on the plane on my way here. Okay, the Canterbury District Health Board has just been awarded another small pot of money in recognition of the increasing burden on mental health services 5 years after the recovery. This is not something that they had predicted. They actually had a very careful and thoughtful discussion as to whether they should go public around this, because they didn't want to alarm people, but at the same time they said that this is a real lack of resource here. We just don't have the capability to respond to this. And the government, fortunately on this occasion, listened. So as I said, I think that this goes on a lot longer in a multiple impact, long time period disaster. Our research program, I'm particularly interested in what happens when those people who we task to look after and to serve communities are going through the same disaster themselves. What happens to those people? Because if that's what we're asking people to do, if those people are not okay, the whole system falls over. If we don't understand more about what happens to those health and welfare sector workers and how they can keep themselves well, how they can maintain their capacity, the sector can maintain their capability, then we're not well prepared. So here are a few papers looking at GPs, nurses, and mental health professionals. So I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes looking at the experience of mental health professionals going through disasters. So this dual exposure, when you're personally affected and you're working to help others, what does that mean for mental health care professionals? So we've already talked about this. We talked about the importance of the secondary stresses. So we're looking at a few related concepts here. We're looking at the idea of vicarious trauma. This idea that you have this experience in your life as a result of the work that you do that changes your view of life forever. You see the world as a broken place, a less safe place, a changed place in some way. It's a quite fundamental shift in your belief system. You have this idea of compassion fatigue. You also have this idea of burnout, empathy, exhaustion. There are many names and overlapping concepts around this. We also have this idea of shared trauma, when the professional is impacted both directly as a member of the affected community and directly as a professional providing services to those adversely affected. So you're coping, but you're coping right alongside the community that you're trying to help. So these were semi-structured interviews with 15 mental health care professionals and 10 counsellors. The interviews took place between July and November last year, so around 4 years after the earthquake sequence started. The mental health care professionals, you can see the distribution there, and the counsellors too. Tends to be more of an older group of people that we were looking at. And this is the range of professions that people were in. I could talk to you more about the process later. I just want to cut to some of the take-home messages here. Okay, there was the recognition of the impact of the earthquakes and the longer-term impact. I think Canterbury was more resilient, and it took 12 months to 2 years, but there's still people out there battling now that I can see going crash further down the track. So they're still watching them and saying, you're not quite there yet, but you're not getting better. You're actually getting worse. And I can see that as a clinician working with you. There was a real impact on workload. So with a week's notice, they were gone, their colleague, which left 40 clients without a case manager, meaning other staff had to pick that up. What they actually saw in the initial period was a lull. There was actually a decrease in cases because everybody was just busy getting on with life. And it took around about 18 months to 2 years for those caseloads to start to increase. And they were surprised and weren't prepared for that, even though the literature told them to be prepared for that. Financial pressures meant that they weren't. The earthquake brought a whole fresh group of people who'd never come to see a therapist because they're highly functioning and used to being able to make decisions. So this goes back to that frontal cortex issue. The idea that they're so overwhelmed with just day-to-day decisions, they strategically can't figure out their lives anymore. They feel directionless, and they're going to counsellors saying, I just don't seem to be able to function. There was a change in the work role. So for those people who are generic mental health care workers, suddenly found that they were doing nothing but disaster work. And that was quite difficult for them. They weren't trained for that. And they put me into different recovery centres for different days and sent me through the assessments. So the nature of their work and the location of the work changed quite a lot. There's a recognition to this idea of actually they were going through this at the same time as a community, and that was very new for them. It's relatively new as a concept in terms of how we understand it. But they also felt that there was something that was new in terms of the bond that they had with their client. And some of those artificial boundaries that we put in place dissolved. You know, there was a commonality of experience, and it was okay to talk about that, and that felt like a really good engagement mechanism for them. But they also found it quite a triggering environment. You know, there were lots of things that were being talked about because people were talking about not only their earthquake experience, but other experiences in their life up until that point, where there were a lot of triggers all coming up in the same session. A lot of counsellors found that quite difficult. Lots and lots of sources of support that the mental health counsellors drew upon, but what's it like when your supervisor is also affected by the disaster? So it's not just you, your client, but it's your supervisor too. And this is where I say that, you know, my initial experience of feeling not close enough, my distance actually felt like it was really useful. So one of the roles that I stepped into more was more of a supervision role then for groups of counsellors who were going through this. There was the emotional impact and the exhaustion. I'm just going to finish through this and move on to self-care. One of the things that they identified upon in reflection, they hadn't really thought about it until this research interview, was they weren't so good about self-care. They saw a lot of helping professionals during that time, and the standout feature was alcohol and drug use, and they weren't so good at looking after themselves. So the workload increased, not just immediately. There was this greater awareness of support and self-care behaviours, but they recognised they weren't so good at doing that for themselves. One way of looking after yourself is this idea of called Schwartz rounds. Has anybody been to a hospital grand round? Hospital grand round, yeah, is where you go and you talk about a case, and you present a case for about 45 minutes. A Schwartz round is not about the case. A Schwartz round is 45 minutes where you have a team of people involved in a patient's care, and you talk about how the care of that patient affected you. And your reflections on how it affected upon your own well-being. So it's quite carefully facilitated, but this was used in the Boston Marathon bombings, and it was very helpful for those clinicians and associated workers who are involved in that. So just to close off, just inviting you to just reflect upon those 8 virtues again. And we'll put these back up on the list. But thinking about how you work across sectors, how many boundaries do you stride across? We talked about it in one of the groups that often you have these boundary people that sit astride lots and lots of different disciplines. Those are really interesting, valuable people. You probably are one of those people. So think about where you sit in your teams. How do you get measured on your effectiveness? How do your bosses measure your effectiveness? Are they the same? Are they different? Because often we don't fit very well working in disaster management as mental health professionals. We're kind of odd. We publish in strange journals that don't really count for our reviews. Yeah? So really thinking about how that fits for you. But for me, that's even more reason for us to support each other and to stay in contact with each other. And that's really what I found most useful after 2012. It's really encouraged me to step forward and to connect with other people. Thank you.
Questions? I bet there are many. Yeah.
So thank you for thoughtful discussion. But the model you discussed, in India I have seen that the role of psychologists are least considered in the disaster mental health, and it is being considered that the psychological intervention should focus after the initial rescue process, and maybe after 1 month or 2 months or 3 months of the disaster. But the advocacy, leadership, all those issues are not at all considered in many of the developing countries. I'm sure that other countries will also share the same viewpoint. So where already the role of psychologists are only focusing on the intervention part, not on the other policy making and leadership and advocacy part, how this model can be implemented in the developing countries if you can have some suggestions.
Yeah, sure. I can have some suggestions around that. I'm an outlier in my own country too. There aren't many people like me who do what I do. Okay, so up until the Christchurch earthquake, very much so, that mental health was just looked at. Okay, we deal with the top 3% of the people who have the highest need. We don't do anything other than that. So really intervening in that public mental health, that leadership kind of like role, still is quite unusual. What's happening in New Zealand at the moment is that the lead for disaster care is the Ministry of Social Development. Has been for the last 10 years. There's now a change in the regulations that this is going to be passed over to the Ministry of Health from the 1st of December this year. Health is pushing back. Health leadership is saying, yeah, sure, we can do this. Mental health services are saying this is not our work. So we're still having this debate. We're still having this argument around whose work is this, whose responsibility is this. So it's unfinished business. I'm presenting it here just for 45 minutes. And as I say, it's still an ongoing discussion. But I think what's important for us to do is to support each other. So if we think that leadership is important, if we think that mental health care is wider than just helping within the first 1 or 2 months, then we need to promote that message. We need to tie people into the international literature, and we also need to help to contribute to that international literature as well. So you are engaged in this journal, right, that you gave me a copy of. So making sure that you're spreading it out to people like me, to other people as well, and to make sure that it's read, or inviting contributions to your journal where we say, this is great, think about 4 years, think about 5 years. If you talk to Māori communities in New Zealand, they encourage us to think about 50 years, 100 years. So it's a much bigger time frame, and partly it's around orienting people to that. It's not an easy task.
I have one. Yeah. Thank you
Sorry.
so much for the presentation. In so many ways, I felt that you're speaking out for me and for Nepal, for all what we underwent. And of course, especially the last part, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation too. And regarding the role of mental health professionals there, and I think, because this earthquake brought us to a situation where people think that mental health has a role, but it's in not in a very positive way too. They think that a situation like an earthquake, there's going to be a whole lot of mental health problems. As data says, it's not so much, probably about only 10%, 5 to 10, or depending on the site and situation, and of course many other factors. But then, so that is one outcry that they do feel that yes, mental health is needed, but that is something again that we need to focus also to the awareness part. But again, it's the kind of support that we got as I think this is also very important to understand in a disaster situation where in a country like Nepal, when yes, international support we do get, but there was so much of help that came into the country that was actually not needed. And it was just outpouring at that moment. As you said, it was a honeymoon period, definitely, but it was just overloaded. Yeah. And so what we need and would require probably is, after this, and what needs to be done, because generally that's what we are lacking. Yeah. And so, it was too much in both ways, to what we actually experienced and actually to what really came in, and how we should sustain. And I was just wondering, the work that you did, and you said you've come up with a compilation of the support. Do you think that would be universal? It would work out to communities like Nepal, and I'm just interested, and probably The research that you just highlighted on the mental health status of people, of the mental health professionals, I think that would be, it just opened my mind. It should be substance for research in our community itself too.
Sure, I think
Thank
that,
you.
no problem, thank you for the kind comments. I think absolutely there's an opportunity there for you as a research project. As far as I know, Katrina, mental health professionals got looked at, Christchurch, and maybe one other one. I can't fully recall where that was, but there haven't been that many that have looked upon the burden of mental health professionals as they go through an extended disaster recovery. In terms of the support that's offered, so disaster medical assistance teams do not tend to have psychological professionals on them. Their role is not seen to be doing that because they recognise that it's a long-term, sustainable solution that's needed. So often if they do have psychologists, they're internally focused around team cohesion rather than externally focused working with local communities, although they may undertake trainer kind of like work. I have a similar role within the New Zealand Medical Assistance Team, so I know around the global protocols around that. But what you're talking about is what happens when you have a country that perhaps does not have resources to be able to direct towards this outside of disaster time, let alone within disaster time. Then one of the things that people mistake during disaster times is that people have, of course, they have reactions and they respond to this. Yeah. They tend to be temporary. They tend to go away. But if there are big inequalities, if there are issues with access to mental health care that existed beforehand, of course they're going to exist afterwards too. So partly it's a bigger conversation around advocating for mental health services. I went to a workshop about a year and a half ago where I think someone from the Marshall Islands said that they had one part-time person working for the whole of this massively distributed area. How on earth can we think about disaster preparedness at the same time? And I have great sympathy for that position, right? So Sendai is an opportunity for countries to be working together. Part of the agreement on Sendai is to develop regional clusters where people are going to be assisting with each other. So there is a peer review kind of process that's been set up in place. I would probably start talking about countries working together in clusters, saying, okay, so we have resource, how can we usefully use that resource across borders for when we have disasters, not just in response, but also in recovery? How can we call upon that resource within an extended recovery, not just response? I think those would be useful conversations to start having. As you say, it's not always needed at that particular response time, it's at other times.
Yeah. And to what he just commented, I don't think, actually we feel that it's not, urgently required because generally it is safety and security and the recovery work is so much there. And in a terrain like Nepal, reaching the mountains and the hills is very, very difficult, because 3/4 of the landscape is such that it's all mountains and hills, so it's very, very difficult. So I think generally rescue and recovery is very, very important.
Yeah. Well, I think I just want to sort of back up what both of you are saying. I think precisely for the reason that you mentioned that in the Marshall Islands they just have a tiny proportion of one person, and you talked about how dispersed the population is and how few the resources are. That is a very big argument for having psychologists involved at the public health phase, public messaging level, because you can reach many people who you cannot and will never reach in person. And because psychologists know, because our study is the study of individual adaptation, we are in a great position to be the ones to be developing these messages, and we're crucial in those teams. And just a comment about secondary traumatic stress or burnout or fatigue, compassion fatigue it's been called. There's quite a lot of work on this in the US, less on disasters than on violent acts. Yeah. You may or may not know that the DSM-5 has put witnessing of sort of horrendous things as a result of being a mental health professional, for example, is now considered one, you can meet criteria for PTSD on that basis. So for example, in Katrina, they sent mental health professionals along with the recovery teams to recover bodies, and those people would be at high risk for PTSD themselves, and I'm pretty sure it would be the same in your context also. I think we have very important roles to play in all of these aspects of disaster recovery.
Am I allowed to share some of my experiences as part of the pilot team for a disaster management?
Just wondering if there are any more questions.
Questions from other people?
Yeah.
No, I wanted to ask, because I'm interested in what you said earlier, that you were not able to address that, the issue of people coming in and they were not supposed to be there, because that was also a big issue for us in the aftermath of PIAD, because there was just this outpouring of support, but then there was just nobody there to keep track of which organization was doing which, and then people were getting all of these kinds of modalities, they got confused and all. So what would be your suggestion? How do we deal with that kind of issue?
Yeah. I guess for me, it's we also had similar things going on in New Zealand for Christchurch. We had all kinds of people with weird and wonderful different treatment modalities, and essentially the only fallback position was show me the evidence. Show me the evidence that this is going to be useful. And if they didn't have a good answer or weren't able to engage in that conversation, we just denied access. So unless they were pre-cleared or could come with some arguments of where and how they could be useful, we said, actually, we're not going to allow you to be in that area. I had a different experience. So it counts as what I said beforehand about people not being of the area. What happens if you do have a shared traumatic reality with that area, right? And there are a limited number of psychologists, and are going to be working there for a long time. What happens in that situation? Because I got asked this question by an Australian who works with rural communities and said, okay, so if we have a disaster in our area, we live in a typhoon area, and there's maybe like 6 psychologists in the region, what do? How do you get past that shared traumatic reality? In which case, I think that probably you could build a case to say, well, maybe you need to have a sustained and sustainable relationship. So we know in humanitarian work that there have been cases where people have kept up correspondence with psychologists or mental health professionals as they've left, and they use therapeutic letters as a way of continuing an intervention. So you're familiar with the idea of a therapeutic letter where you reframe and you re-summarize someone's experience in a written form so that they can keep it with them. And then you have an ongoing dialogue with that distant counsellor in that way. So there may be other more imaginative ways that we've not yet tested, not yet thought about, other than a one-to-one personal relationship.
So in your country, you have like a body that coordinates all of this, like approves or disapproves these kinds of activities?
No, it's pretty much word of mouth. Like, so you will hear about it, or the person in the district's health board, mental health professional, someone will get told. But often they may have already started the work, right? So then you have to kind of like intervene afterwards. There is no regulated process. You're supposed to have a credential, but people kind of like, may get under the radar in the chaos of a disaster situation, which is often what happens.
You mentioned the character virtues or character strengths. You had a list. With your experience at the field and with research, what virtue or virtues do you find manifested by the victims or survivors? That's why they can easily get by or easily cope. What among these virtues were you able to identify that helped them recover faster?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I think as we've gone through the recovery, certainly courage has been incredibly important. But I think for a lot of people who are advocating on the behalf of not just themselves, but for wider community, the sense of social justice is incredibly important. They see resources, they see work going on, and they are mindful of who is benefiting, who is not benefiting, because they have the community recovery in mind. So that sense of social justice may come at a cost to them individually, but this self-effacing charity, this idea of being able to work on the behalf of others without thinking about what benefit you get from that, I think has become increasingly important in the work that I've seen at a community level.
I'd just like to ask, because you presented it in a New Zealand context, I'd just like to ask, In the Philippines, we're a very developing country, a third world country. I just wonder, how can you be able to really advocate for mental health if your priority as a country is really to get this, to have these people, to have food and shelter and clothes, which is the main priorities, and really mental health is not a priority in itself, since the government is really busy, covering for funds and the basic needs of these people.
Okay, sure. It's a really good question. When you have scarce resource, how do you allocate those resources? How do those decisions get made? So the WHO defines health as all of health. Okay, it's not just physical health, it's mental and physical well-being too. Essentially, you have to make a business case. You have to go to your treasury, your financial decision makers and say, okay, so you can choose not to do this. What is the cost of not doing this? The cost of not doing this actually outweighs, if you take a 5-year stretch of a plan or a 10-year stretch of plan, it outweighs the cost of actually addressing this and starting to put a system in place to dealing with this. And that's the approach that we took. It's like, okay, so you don't intervene at a public mental health level, which will cost you this much. This is how much it's going to cost you if, say, 10% of these cases go up to the next tier of level. Do you want to do that? And then you present them with options, right, so that they can make a decision. The problem with that is political timeframes, right? Because often people will say, the political timeframe in New Zealand is 3 years. You have a general election every 3 years. It's crazy. It's really, really short, right? In other places, it's 4 or 5 years, whatever. Often, if it goes over a political timeframe, they'll say, well, I'm not going to make a decision on that. The next government can make a decision on that. Yeah. So that's a real problem. You have some cases where Treasury in the UK instigated the Sure Start program, which was a 10-year plan by the Treasury because no other actor was working in that space. They committed over, at that point, 3 terms of government to do that. Now, it's up and down as to whether you evaluate that and the effectiveness of various different components of a Sure Start program. But it was a Sure Start program is a child intervention program particularly targeted at those people who are particularly in terms of income, were at risk. But it was a completely empty space. Nobody had thought about it. But hey, kids win political votes, right? They couldn't lose. That's what they thought.
I was just wondering about the handbook that you did about the mental health, because I understand that there are also a lot of aborigines in New Zealand, probably, and I wonder if part of that is the inclusion of indigenous concepts in the mental health handbook. I think because we talked a couple of times, and I told you that we also did the same thing in some islands in the Asia Pacific, yeah. Right? And I'm just wondering, did you find a way to include them, or you were planning to include that in the future?
Yeah, so if you look at the public mental health program that's going on in Christchurch, the one where I put you up the big posters, so they have a Māori mental health model that directly feeds into that. So they go along in parallel. There's a great degree of overlap. If I'm honest, the Māori mental health model is probably more holistic, takes in bigger, it's much more of an ecologically valid model, I think. And the messaging is derived directly from that mental health model that's been derived. So they're going on in parallel. And we are trying to take the best of both, but we're also focus grouping it as well. So when we're putting out and developing those messages, we're going to the communities that they're intended for, checking out with them before we put them out in public. Yeah, absolutely. We're thinking about not just the Western mental health model, but the mental health models of the communities that we're trying to serve.
Good. Okay. Yeah.